Jeffrey Nelson is the editor of Perfect Sewing, Reflections of a Bookman, which is taken from the writings of Henry Regnery, and also the publisher of ISI Books. Mr. Nelson, who was Henry Regnery, and why did his writings deserve your attention?
Well, Henry Regnery was one of the great independent publishers of our time. He was principally known as a publisher of conservative books, and he was the publisher, more than anyone else, who gave shape and definition through the books that he published to the then emerging conservative movement in America. His publishing firm was launched in 1947, and shortly thereafter, in the 50s, a disparate group of intellectuals came together to form a movement of ideas that eventually, to skip along a couple of decades, would achieve political success in America through the election of Ronald Reagan and congressional elections, etc. So it was a movement that began in the mid part of the century that was very much identified with the publishing imprint of Henry Regnery. And it was a movement of ideas that really changed the shape, in many ways, of the American political landscape. So he's a very important figure, much neglected figure, but extremely important and influential.
By neglected, you mean what? That he's not well known by his own name?
Yeah, he's not well known by his own name. Beyond being an important publisher, he was also a wonderful essayist and stylist. He was a thoughtful publisher. He was a man of vision, integrity, resoluteness, courage. He wrote many essays that spanned virtually the decades that he was publishing, from the early years right through until his death. He was writing perceptive essays of cultural criticism, literary criticism. He was very engaged in the literary and cultural life of his native Chicago. But that part of his career is less known than the imprint of his books. Regnery is not well known. Even Henry Regnery himself is not well known, I must say, probably even within conservative circles themselves. I think the most that they know is that there's this imprint, Regnery imprint, but the man who stood beside it and the colossal achievement that he attained is very much less known.
Well, what's his personal story? Where did he come from? What was his family like? What was his growing up like?
Yeah. Well, in Perfect Sewing, the first couple of chapters really deal with the early life of Henry Regnery. They're some of the most personal writings that he ever penned. He was from Chicago, from a suburb of Chicago called Hinsdale. He grew up and was formed principally during the period just after World War I to the eve of the Great Depression, a time when sort of the 19th century was completed, as he thought, the project, and the 20th century really began. It was an idyllic life in Hinsdale. He's of German ancestry. His great-grandfather came from Germany, was a wine barrel maker. They came from Trier, Germany. And if you'll notice on the Regnery imprint, the Regnery logo, you see it on I think you have a copy right there on the Conservative Mind. This logo, very famous logo in conservative publishing, is the Trier Gate, and it's the gate in Trier, Germany, which is
and you can go and see that.
Oh yes, you can go and see that today. It is the ancestral home of Henry Regnery, and so an appropriate logo. And so he was comes from a German background and ancestry. His father was in textile industries. He was a very prosperous manufacturer. Neither his grandfather or his father were particularly educated in the sense of schooling. Regnery's generation was the first, which was typical of American immigrants of that age. But Henry Regnery's father was a very important industrialist and really imbued upon his son a sense of responsibility. Henry Regnery's father comes a beautiful essay that begins the book. The character of his father and the responsibility that he felt towards his employees, the fact that he never lost a week's wage during the Great Depression. He scaled back his own profits for the sake of his company, and the bond that he felt toward the immigrant workers that came to work in the textile plants, to the extent of going to visit local immigrant churches, Polish churches, etc., to see how the workers were faring and what their reaction was to his work. All this made an impression Regnery. And I think the word responsibility was a word that really characterized Regnery's sense of duty in publishing. He really felt the responsibility to the written word, to the process of cultural, the legacy of values and Western civilization that he was transmitting through his work. So he's a very keen sense, very informed by his early beginnings in the Chicago, very bucolic and innocent period that he grew up in. And I think that sense of the world being lost, the shaking, after World War II, the lost sense of values and communities and the transformation of communities, suburbias developing and highways paving through the fields that they once played, had an effect upon him. There was a real sense of longing and a lost sense of values that he tried to recover through much of the work that he did. So in a sense that his publishing was an active, well, it may be an unconscious, but often I think conscious act of recovery, trying to recover a world lost and shattered by the experience of World War I, the Depression, and then World War II.
Well, as we talk about exactly what it is he did do, try to summarize, if you can, his philosophy and what he meant by conservative or conservatism.
Yeah. Well, Henry Regnery, when he first began publishing, didn't consider himself a conservative publisher. In 1947, conservatism wasn't much of a word in vogue. There were different words, but individualist, perhaps, was a word that was used. But essentially, he viewed himself as a publisher who was going against a liberal monolith within the publishing world, that liberalism so dominated the publishing circle to constitute basically an effective form of censorship, and there wasn't really a lot of room for a discussion or a pursuit of truth beyond sort of an accepted framework. So Regnery didn't start off considering himself to be a conservative in the sense that we would view it today. He saw himself as a cherishing and upholding a set of values and standards that were central to Western civilization. Sort of a critical and creative spirit that came together and was important for liberty and for order to move forward. I think the shattering influence of World War I, and then especially for him World War II, left a sense that the values of Western civilization were disintegrating, the normative values were in decay, that totalitarianism regimes were on the rise, threats to personal freedom were everywhere. And so there was a sense of trying to preserve and conserve in a deepest sense, not in the political sense that we think of today. When we say conservative, we automatically, Newt Gingrich, Republican Party, that our minds leap that way. But it wasn't that way. It was much more of a deeper civilizational impulse that moved him, conserving at the deepest levels a core set of values and an understanding of American institutions that animated his project.
Why do you think that with those views he went into publishing as opposed to, say, public office, or to just staying as an essayist?
Well, he could have had a successful career following his father's, assuming his father's company, and being a textile manufacturer. He would have been very wealthy, and he, in fact, when he made the leap to publishing, was working at that line. I don't think politics was ever an option for him.
Why not?
Well, he was a very shy and reticent man. I don't think the limelight, stump speeching, the policy implementation. He was a very thoughtful and reserved man, considering of first principles. I think there's politicians a certain gift. Being a politician is a certain gift, and I think Regnery had a much more thoughtful strain. He was trained at Harvard, as MIT, as an economist, but always had a very deep historical sense because of his experience as a student in Germany. And he, I guess in a sense that he got into, he was always interested in the world of ideas and affairs, and he began in Washington, D.C. here as a pamphleteer with Human Events, which is still going today, 45 years later, but then it was a small paper devoted to foreign policy. And again, they were, it was concerned with the aftermath of World War I, the historical record, the result of some of the conferences that went on, and the fate of so many of the countries in Eastern Europe, the fate of freedom abroad. So Regnery began through a newspaper, and then by extension publishing a few pamphlets. And then his teacher in Germany passed him a book by Max Picard called Hitler in Ourselves. A very sort of suggestive title, Hitler in Ourselves. And it was about the state of the German mind, the German soul, if you will. Beyond that, more that as being a reflection of the state of the Western soul in general. So there was a sort of a perceived sickness in Germany that Picard and Regnery and others perceived was more emblematic of the West in general than many observers thought. So I think he viewed, in order for him to really take upon that project of publishing Max Picard's Hitler and Ourselves, he thought that he had to dedicate himself full-time to publishing, to translate it, to market it, to publish it. He just believed the written word was so powerful and important, and there was a void and vacuum, and that Picard's work gave him the impetus to get into it.
And what year did he form his company, and what was the name of it?
1947.
1947, and it was called?
The Henry Regnery Company.
And does it still exist today?
Yes, but not under the same title. And today it's the Regnery Publishing Company. Henry Regnery sold, through some unfortunate circumstances, in 1977, I believe, the original Henry Regnery Company became something called Contemporary Books, and went from publishing, serious books of art, politics, and culture to sort of auto mechanic books, etc. But shortly thereafter, he founded a new company called the Regnery Publishing Incorporated, and that's what exists today.
Is he alive today?
No, he died in 1996 at the age of 84.
What did he die of?
Brain cancer, I think. It was something fairly awful.
Tell the story of this book. You've already alluded to it. It's The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot. We happen to have the 7th edition here by Russell Kirk. What's the story behind this book and its significance?
Well, its significance is twofold for the purposes of our conversation, and a tremendous significance on the Henry Regnery Company. To that point, Henry Regnery was publishing books that were critical of liberalism, but didn't have anything positive to offer, a positive worldview to offer. Along came a professor from Michigan State University who was studying at St. Andrews in Scotland by the name of Russell Kirk. A friend and a British editor by the name of Sidney Gare suggested the book to Henry Regnery, that there was a manuscript floating out there that was really something, that Kirk was a young guy who was about as communicative as a turtle, I think is the way that Gare described Kirk, but when he got behind a typewriter, the results were most impressive. And indeed, that was the case. Henry Regnery wrote and asked for the manuscript, which had recently been rejected by Knopf. Knopf wanted to cut the book up in half and do all kinds of things. So Kirk sent this manuscript to Regnery. It was called The Conservative Route. But Henry Regnery saw in it something more than a route. He thought that while they might have been routed to some extent, conservatives weren't entirely vanquished, and what Russell Kirk had provided was a unifying and cohesive theme and definition of what conservatism was. It was an intellectual genealogy, as you said, from Burke to Eliot, of the conservative impulse in Britain and America, and it showed a positive presentation of conservatism, conservative ideas, a coherent vision and worldview, and more than that, it argued that conservatism was a vital had a vital historical place within America itself. Remember, in 1955, liberalism was the dominant ideology, if you will. It was the dominant worldview. Lionel Trilling thought there was no conservative tradition in America whatsoever, and Louis Hart and other liberal historians felt that, other than sort of irritable mental gestures on the part of a few people, really there was no conservative tradition in America. And Russell Kirk argued persuasively just the opposite. There was a powerful conservative tradition in America, and he recovered that. And that was such a release for American conservatism, to find they had a tradition that it captured so many young minds, so many young politicians, and really launched the conservative movement. As I said, up to that point, hadn't really been called conservative. People didn't think of themselves as conservatism. It only really happened when Kirk's book came along, and a book by Peter Viereck roughly around the same time called Conservatism Revisited. These books really said, okay, conservatism is a positive, hopeful, persuasive view. It offers a coherent alternative to the liberal monolith, and beyond that, it was a real viable tradition within America itself.
When you talk about a book having that much effect, what does that translate in terms of sales?
Well, not always a lot. I think when Henry Regnery got into publishing early in the late 40s and 50s, his father was said to have said to him that, well, son, this is a textile manufacturer, very successful. If you ever begin to publish books that make money, you can pretty much be assured you're publishing the wrong kind of books. And that...
we're not talking millions here. We're
not talking millions here. No, we're talking many thousands, I mean tens of thousands books, which is a very respectable number. The Conservative Mind, before that, God and Man at Yale, which was a book by William F. Buckley Jr., you may want to allude to at some point, was one of the first books that really began to place Regnery on the bestseller list, if you will. There were some earlier books on anti-communist themes, one by a anti-communist and provocative woman, Freya Utley, on the China question that registered an early blip on the bestseller list for Regnery. But other than that, those kind of successes were few and far between.
Well, let's go back to God and Man at Yale, William F. Buckley. What's the story behind that? How did the manuscript come to the attention of Mr. Regnery, and why did he choose to publish it, and what effect did it have?
Well, first of all, it came to Regnery because there were so few other options. And at the time, in 1947, this book I think was 1951, but roughly around that time there were roughly two other options. Really, Devin Adair, which was an East Coast publisher, and a publisher called Caxton out in Idaho. Other than that, and Regnery was the only other alternative. So again, someone within the organization approached Henry Regnery and let him know that this young phenom at Yale University by the name of Buckley had a terrific manuscript, and he thought he ought to take a look at it. And Regnery, always on the hunt for, as any publisher is, for a good manuscript, especially from a conservative point of view at that age, wrote Buckley. Buckley, who recently said he didn't remember why he sent it to Regnery, or exactly why he took it, but he sent it to Regnery, and Regnery accepted it, and the next season it was published, and it made a huge impact.
What was Buckley's, what made him a phenom at Yale, as you say?
Well, he was a member. He was the chairman of the Yale Daily News. As I recall, he was a captain of the Yale debating team. He and his future brother-in-law, but then best friend L. Brent Bozell, were sort of the wonder kids, and they were real iconoclasts at the time because of these two conservative individualist voices taking on the Yale establishment, and liberal professors like William Sloane Coffin and a bunch of the sort of the premier liberals of their day, very effectively, very persuasively. These were articulate, thoughtful guys with a message that was wholly in opposition to the party line at Yale and other academic institutions at the time.
Well, we've heard about, anybody who follows politics and political history knows about this book, God and Man at Yale, but what is it about? What did it say?
Well, was it about? Just as it said, basically the jettisoning of sort of any sort of Christian understanding of man, of our nature and destiny, of what constitutes a Christian social order in the mainstream curriculum. That the curriculum had sort of gone away and was espousing forms of educational relativism, was undermining. To some extent, the font of Western civilization, Western culture, was perceived to have been Christendom. And when that was overtly rejected by the educational establishment, that was obviously seen to people like Buckley and Bozell as a fundamental threat to the very existence of Western civilization, of which our cherished liberties and freedoms emanated from. So by extension, then, it was a threat to our to the American way of life, freedom. So it was a profound indictment, really, and Yale took it as such. I mean, they set up commissions to investigate the merits of Buckley's charge, whether this was true or not, whether this was happening in the curriculum. There were all sorts of debate. The Alumni magazine focused an entire issue on it, reviews everywhere. It was most gratifying to Regnery. I mean, Regnery was somebody who was interested in the truth, interested in getting the word out, and hoping for an honest, critical response, not for it to be shuffled away and say, well, this is an acceptable sort of form of dialogue, but to engage it, not to accept it. He didn't certainly expect everyone to agree with their point of view, but he had hoped that it would be engaged. And in the case of God and Man at Yale and The Conservative Mind, he was very gratified that it was.
And it actually got on the bestseller list.
Oh yeah, at the bottom of it, but definitely there.
Are both these books, by the way, still in print?
Yes, they are. The God and Man at Yale has an intermittent history. Conservative Mind has been continuously in print, never out of print since it was first published.
I want to go back to Russell Kirk. We've got a picture of him on the back of his book. It shows him at some advanced stage. How old was he when the book came out?
35, 34, around mid-30s.
And what is your connection with Russell Kirk?
Well, I have to confess, I saw him as son-in-law, so that a very personal connection.
You married his daughter.
I married his second daughter, Cecilia, and I was a fellow under him. I studied under him. I worked as an editor on a publication a book review publication that he founded in 1960 called the University Bookman, which still exists today, and I'm honored to edit it to this day.
And after this book came out, he continued as what, and he died when?
He died in April of 1994. He continued as a prolific essayist and really sort of one of the main intellectual forces behind the conservative intellectual renaissance, if you will. He wrote many, many books over 30 books beyond the conservative mind, wide-ranging books. I mean, a very literate man writing best-selling ghost stories. In some circles, as a matter of fact, curious about Russell Kirk, he's better known as a teller of Gothic fiction. In fact, even Stephen King and others look to him as sort of a model of Gothic fiction. He wrote 5 volumes of fiction. Some readers and appreciators of Kirk have no idea of his conservative and literary aspirations, output rather, and read him as a Gothic literature.
Well, let's go on a little bit more about you. I mentioned that you were the publisher of ISI Books. Mm-hmm. What is ISI Books, and what's its mission?
ISI Books is in its 6th year. It's the imprint of a large organization called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which was founded in 1953 and is concerned about the extension from one generation to the next of the basic values of Western civilization and American founding. ISI Books is the publishing imprint, which is really seeking to carve, I think it's a slightly different niche than a conventional publisher. We have a little slightly of university press feel, and that we have academic titles, but we have very much a trade presence and aspirations where our books are meant to be read. They're interdisciplinary. They're conservative in the sense that the deepest sense that Regnery espoused of sort of a interest in the enduring values and institutions of the West and the great ideas and principles upon which our freedoms were based. But our books are not as specialized as university press because they're, as I said, they're meant to be read and to communicate ideas broadly to a literate and interested public. But they are concerned about first principles. And in that sense, they're very much ideas-oriented and ideas-driven.
And how did you come to book publishing?
Well, I came just through a circuitous route, probably like most publishers. I think you asked why Henry Regnery did it. I think he just providentially fell into it, and I think in a sense I did as well. After graduate school at Yale, I worked in a couple of different foundations and came to ISI as an editor, editing its journal, the Intercollegiate Review. And at the time, perceived a vacuum in serious conservative publishing and thought that ISI was particularly well positioned because of its place within the conservative intellectual movement, historically speaking, and its access. ISI is a membership organization, so it has access to over 50,000 students and faculty on the campus. It's a very lively and active institution.
Is it nonprofit?
It's nonprofit, yeah. And so I thought that given the intersection of sort of ideas and activity and activism, we might be able to attract some quality young authors who have a lot to say, but there's not a lot of outlets by which to communicate their point of view, so we thought we could provide that.
Where are you from?
I'm originally from Michigan. I grew up in the same town as Russell Kirk, coincidentally, Plymouth, Michigan, walked the same railroad tracks, and the same pennies were, well, not the same pennies, but pennies were crushed on the same tracks by trains. Squash and flat, walked along the same creeks. I very much understand the sort of the world he emerged from.
Yale graduate. Where'd you go to undergraduate school?
University of Detroit. It's a Jesuit institution.
Back to Mr. Regnery. We talked about his conservatism. What was his view of liberalism? Is it the same thing that people think of when they talk about liberals today?
No, it isn't. It isn't. I mean, yes. I mean, I think there is a sense of sort of the infatuation with, you know, big government, as the phrase is today, and the propensity to sort of drift in that direction to find solutions for all the social problems certainly was one aspect of it. But I think Henry Regnery saw a profounder and deeper view of liberalism as a rejection of sort of the idea of original sin. Henry Regnery saw sin, as it were, as an existential fact problem, and whereas liberals sort of see it as a social problem that sort of be fixed with the right kind of legislation and the right kind of policies passed. We can sort of reconstruct human nature through policy. And Henry Regnery saw that this is a disastrous, this impulse or a vision has disastrous consequences throughout history and recent history through the various ideologies of national socialism and communism, and he very much saw American liberalism as an extension of that, in the sense that they had this fundamental view which he rejected.
In his collected writings, only some of his writings, in Perfect Sowing,
Mm-hmm.
he, and you as editor, talk a little bit about his thoughts on Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
That would be Franklin Roosevelt. What were those thoughts, and how did they evolve?
I don't think they evolved. I think they were pretty fairly consistent, and they weren't friendly toward Roosevelt, nor Woodrow Wilson. I think again it goes back to our earlier part of our conversation where I talked about sort of the experience of World War I and World War II. Regnery's father was very instrumental in the America First movement, which is something that's gotten a lot of press these days through Pat Buchanan and others, and a lot of bad press, print by most people. But it was a movement that was isolationist. It was a movement that was constitutionalist. Isolationist, and Henry Regnery, I should say, was sympathetic to these views. He wasn't an American firster. He had broader views, but still he came from this background, and this view influenced him. He saw Roosevelt as, in his New Deal, as shuttling much of the Constitution to push through his New Deal and to push through a lot of legislation. And Henry Regnery is very sensitive to the integrity of the Constitution and the vision of the Founding Fathers, so he didn't have any respect for appreciation, I should say, for that aspect of the Roosevelt program. The internationalism, the aggressive internationalism of Wilson, and then sort of endorsed by Roosevelt, was another aspect that really deeply troubled him. I think the Wilson, Roosevelt, Churchill, and others, their insistence on unconditional surrender for the Germans was deeply troubling to him. He thought it was a disaster not only for the German people, but for the West in general, of which Germany had played such a vital artistic and cultural and creative role, and he thought that the stamping on the soul of the Germans the way that he did, not in any way approving what was going on. And
talk more about unconditional surrender, because the I guess conventional wisdom or the general view is that unconditional surrender, both in the European theater and the Pacific, was a good thing.
Well, I suppose if you were British and American and maybe French, that was so. And I'm not here to argue one way or another as a historian, but I'll say from Henry Regnery's point of view that wasn't the case. I mean, he saw that this was asking too much of the German people, who had been essentially the Versailles Treaty in World War I had caused deep division and had laid the groundwork for World War II. And the unconditional surrender was untenable for most of the Germans. They were prideful. They were a people of pride, and they were a people of great, enormous cultural and literary achievement, who were basically forced to come to their knees. And he didn't feel like that for the aftermath of the war that was a good thing for Europe in general, and not a just thing for the German people.
What was his take, his views on Richard Nixon?
Well, not exactly. I mean, he wasn't. He had an ambivalent, I think, view toward Nixon. I think he was disappointed in the Watergate episode. I think he was ambivalent toward Nixon as a conservative. I don't think he thought he was necessarily, in his line, committed to the deeper conservative project that he was. But I think he thought he clearly was a victim of the press, and of the liberal press in particular. And I thought he felt that the press was unrelenting toward Nixon and unfair in many ways, and that they did irreparable harm to the institution of the presidency, the way that they attacked the institution and the man.
What did you think about Goldwater and the Goldwater movement?
Yeah, well, he was, well, as most conservatives were at that time, on board with Goldwater. I mean, Kirk and others, he was at the time in 1964 the first great hope for taking ideas and moving them to the realm of practice, moving from theory to practice, if you will. And Roosevelt, everyone got behind Roosevelt. I mean, I'm sorry, Goldwater. back on Roosevelt. Goldwater, the Goldwater presidency was a watershed. The presidential campaign was a watershed for conservatives because it really showed that, hey, we've got a movement of ideas here, and this is effective, and we can organize, we can come together, and even though there are many different strands, because conservatism is no monolith. When we talk about conservatism, we think there's this lockstep group of people out there sort of chugging along and behind a set of ideas, but that's hardly the case. It's no monolith. It's a very diverse intellectual group with lots of different aims and orientations that basically came together because they opposed left liberalism and they opposed communism. And that was they could march together under that banner. And Goldwater proved that, hey, this movement, this coalition, this project could work. And it was a National Review project principally, but most conservatives got behind it, and I think Regnery was among them.
What do you think, if you were looking at the current battle for the Republican presidential nomination, his observations would be?
Oh, I can't speak for Mr. Regnery. His would be more profound than mine would be. Deeply sensitive man. I don't think he'd be at all satisfied with the current crop of candidates in any way. I don't think that the way that they loosely handle the facts and the truth for sound bites and is in any way advances the cause of civilization or conversation at all. I think he'd be deeply disappointed and with every justification.
On that point, did he ever inject himself at all in these quadrennial debates of any kind?
No. No, as I said, Mr. Regnery was a very creative, very sensitive, very literate man. He was a cellist. He organized symphonies. He was a member of he was a president of one of the great conservatories in America and in Chicago for music. He was a member of the Cliff Dwellers Club, which is a famous literary club in the Midwest in Chicago. The Chicago Literary Club was the place where he delivered some of his finest, longest, most thoughtful lectures. He was most at home in many ways publishing poets and literary critics than he was publishing politicos or political treatises of one kind or another. No, he was a deeply literary man and not altogether comfortable in the political arena.
Did he ever make any money in publishing?
Well, I think he made some money. I don't think he made a lot of money. I think he put his money into publishing. I think he put his money where his heart and his mind was. Few publishers do this in an age of corporate publishing. That's a very rare thing. I can think of maybe one young publisher by the name of Tom Spence who does that kind of thing today, puts his own money behind his imprint. Bill Buckley put his money behind National Review and presumably still does, but there are a few people who do that any longer with the hope. The hope is to maybe balance the sheet at the end of the day, but really the objective is to transform hearts and minds and not to, increase the bottom line in your bank account.
If we were back in the 50s, what would be the fora that we'd be seeing him or hearing him? For example, where did his columns appear? And a lot of these essays that appear in your book, Perfect Sowing, that you've edited, where would they be published so that we could have read them?
Well, in conservative journals, principally literary journals, not in National Review. I don't know that he ever published in National Review, not to my knowledge.
He didn't do any newspaper op-eds, that kind of thing?
No, he never did. He never was that kind of writer. As the essays reflect their critical essays, their literary essays, their essays on the nature of publishing and on the nature of poetry and criticism and the importance of that for the Republic of Letters, so to speak. Modern Age is a journal that was founded in 1957 by Russell Kirk as editor, but Henry Regnery as publisher. Henry Regnery published there for until his death. I think his last essay actually appeared. His first essay may have appeared in Modern Age, and I doubt his first one, but close to it. And his last essay certainly did. And Modern Age has been a principal conservative journal of ideas that has been, as Russell Kirk said, sort of a protest against the illusions of the age, a sort of a romantic way to evoke the spirit of a journal. And really Modern Age has been that, a very thoughtful conservative journal that, it's interesting, paralleled, I think National Review was founded in 55, Modern Age in 57, and those two in different ways sort of tracked each other and reflected the development of conservatism.
We'll talk a little bit about his thoughts about the publishing business, because he was in it, and a number of these essays in your collection, The Perfect Sowing, refer to it. For example, he does a critique of the Book of the Month Club.
Yeah.
What was his thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, his thoughts were, I mean, there's much criticism of the Book of the Month Club because of there was a suspicion that the Book of the Month Club would standardize literary tastes, and Henry Regnery's view was, well, literary tastes are standardized already by the New York Review of Books and the New York Times Book Review, and those people basically define, what's going to be read, and the book clubs are just now, reflect that and what they offer. I think his big concern was tastes and literary standards. And I think what he saw, what the interesting part of his sort of take on the Conservative Book Club, he tracks the history of the Book of the Month Club, and he tracks the history of the Book of the Month Club and shows, at least argues, that there has been a decline in tastes and literary standards in America from the time the club first began to to this day, and it's a pretty convincing tour through the very elevated tastes of the early years to the more sort of psychosexual tastes, if you will, of some of the stuff that they put out today, which he didn't think added anything to the Republic of Letters.
How were he and his books regarded by the New York publishing establishment?
With respect, I think, but not necessarily always critical attention as much as he would like. I think his better books were received critically, and he was very grateful for that. I think he realized that it was an uphill climb to be a conservative publisher and to offer books by European and American literary critics, but that he was hopeful that they were of such high quality and seriousness that they would be at least recognized and discussed, and in many cases they were. So the literary, I think they viewed Henry Regnery's company as a curious foray, times a nostalgic, eccentric foray into book publishing in the world of ideas, but that their ideas were so compelling and presented at such a high level. I think Henry Regnery was a real stickler for taste and standards. Standards were most important to him and to his editors, and so his books always were of a very high standard, and so they were critically received generally, not to the degree that would have satisfied him, but generally they were critically received, if not commercially, saleable.
Did he inspire others? That is, to other conservative publishing and authors?
Well, I think he inspired and he heartened. I think remember, it was a desert of conservative publishing prior to Regnery's books. I mean, that Henry Regnery building in Chicago must have seemed like an oasis to a young conservative in the 50s and 60s visiting there, just desperate to drink, of some serious conservative literature, and they found that in Regnery. So I think in that sense he inspired an entire movement. I mean, I think he informed it through his books. I mean, there's only so much you can do through book publishing. It's not the sum total of a movement. There's other things, magazines and political aspects of a movement, but clearly book publishing is central, and that's the repository of ideas, and so you had countless individuals that considered themselves conservatives that came of age reading Regnery's books, that ideas were shaped and formed, and conservatism was identified and made sense, and it was such of a high quality that it gave them pride. I mean, liberals were always, saying, oh, you guys don't have a tradition, you're not sophisticated, you're just defending a status quo, whatever. All kinds of rejections, but you could pull out a Regnery book, and it was of the highest quality of seriousness. I mean, whether it was from European authors like Max Picard or Gabriel Marcel or Eric Bogan or Leo Strauss or whomever, or American authors like Richard Weaver or Albert J. Nock or Russell Kirk. I mean, these were things that young conservatives were proud of and proud to take into the arena of ideas with and go back and forth. So he influenced that way. I mean, in terms of, did he influence other publishers? Well, there's not been a lot of conservative publishing per se. I think people who were interested in publishing then came to work. There are people now, one of the editors at a Midwestern firm called Liberty Press was schooled under Henry Regnery. He's now an editor of a nice book imprint out there, and I think there are a number of editors. Harry Crocker is the executive editor of Regnery Publishing today and was clearly influenced by Henry Regnery to the good. So yeah, I mean, you have people, Chris Briggs is a senior editor at ISI, a very able young editor who was very much influenced by Henry Regnery himself and his work. So yeah, I think there are people today who are out there, and it seems to have skipped a generation, kind of interesting.
What about yourself?
Oh, well, clearly, am in great debt to Mr. Regner. In fact, it's kind of a curious. I'm very grateful and honored to sit every day at the desk of Mr. Henry Regner.
Literally the desk.
To ISI Books, literally his desks in his Chicago and his Lake Michigan residence came to ISI, and so every day, I sit at that desk and recall the achievements, the great manuscripts and books that must have been laid upon it, and
what
the
kind of desk
inspiration.
is it?
It's an oak pine desk that was built constructed actually in Harrisonburg, Virginia, according to the specifications that Mr. Regner asked. So I was very much influenced him. I had a great honor and opportunity to meet him on a couple of occasions. I visited him near the end of his life, and profoundly interested. He was such a wonderfully humane man. You get that sense when you see his books. They're so humane. They're so literary. They defy categorization. I mean, we use the word conservative, and it's a little restricting for Henry Regner, because he was so humane and beyond and broader than that in many ways. And you walked into his place, and near the end of his life, to that day, he had some of his early books and other books laid open, no TV, very simple surroundings, Piranesi prints on the wall, and he and his wife sitting across from one another reading, some wonderfully interesting books, profound poetry, and it was a civilized life of conversation and interest and ideas.
And this book of yours, Perfect Sewing, is that your title?
Yes, it comes from T.S. Eliot. From his Choruses on the Rock, which says, yes, I have said, take no thought of the harvest, but only of perfect sowing. And I think that's such a beautiful imagery for any publisher. I mean, you're honored if you can sow seeds in the civil social order, in the fabric of the Republic of Ideas. Books are seeds, and when you look at the line of books that Henry Regner published, and you think, this is a man who, what strikes you is this is a man who cared deeply about ideas and who really thought that books transformed people personally. And he wasn't concerned about money. He was concerned about seeds that could transform people individually, and beyond that then, as collectively through, renew the culture.
Jeffrey Nelson is the publisher of ISI Books and the editor of Perfect Sewing, Reflections of a Bookman, from the writings of Henry Regner. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.